Welcome back to the Bayesian Conspiracy. I'm Eneasz Brodsky, as always.
I'm Stephen Zuber, as I am Monday through Friday.
And I am Richard J. Acton, as I usually am.
At least whenever you're on a podcast.
Yes.
Welcome back, Richard. I guess, Stephen, you're saying we last had him on three or 4 years ago?
It was just before I graduated from my PhD and shortly after I moved to Germany, I think.
Was that 3 years ago then, or 4?
3, ish.
3, okay.
Time is a flat circle.
I think last time we were speaking about aging, right?
We were, yes. Yeah.
All about aging, episode 127.
I did an episode of my podcast, the Xenothesis podcast, on longevity and aging and immortality stuff. There's a bunch of really good notes for follow-up and additional reading materials in the footnote for that. Sorry to jump off with a plug.
That's perfect. Can you send us a link and we'll put it in the show notes?
Absolutely.
But we are not here to talk about aging today. We are here to talk about the Guild of the Rose.
Lots of spot.
Yes. But when I was going over the notes up here, it said that you have joined with the Guild of the Rose recently.
I am, yeah. I have been a member for a little while now. And me and David Youssef are running a podcast, The Oasis of Rest. It's been on a slightly eclectic schedule up to this point. Hopefully it will become a bit more regular in the relatively near future. But we've done a couple of episodes of me and him chatting. We're an interesting mix. And then a couple of interviews with other founding members of the Guild.
Fantastic. The Guild of the Rose, for people who are not familiar, it's an online organization which helps people level up their rational skills and provide a bit of an online community for rationalists. We are big fans, and that is why we are partnering with them. It sounds like Richard is a big fan as well, seeing as you are part of the group.
Yep, been enjoying it.
All right, but the real reason that we're actually here is to talk about the academic publishing, because we had 2 episodes ago, The Rise and Fall of Peer Review, and you have a lot of things that you've been thinking and writing about that topic for quite a while, and so you contacted me immediately after. You said, yeah, I've got a lot of writing on this. Would you like to do a follow-up episode? And we said, fuck yeah, you're Richard Acton.
Well, I mean, to be clear, I don't have a lot of published writing as of yet. I have a lot of random notes that I might try and turn into a book at some point.
These words look like writing to me, so it counts in my opinion.
I should probably preface with my opinions on this subject are not those, or not necessarily reflective of those of my employer. I'm speaking entirely in a personal capacity here.
Are they reflective of the Guild of the Rose?
I would imagine not.
Okay.
Just me, purely personal capacity. The preface to this is I've been thinking rather a lot about the problems in academic publishing for quite a while. Probably the last 6 or so years since I sort of actually started being along the professional path towards being in academia. I've been kind of diverting a little bit away from the primary path that one normally pursues in an academic career. I've been working more as a bioinformatician, and now my job title is data outputs manager. So I'm doing some sort of slightly parallel stuff to a conventional academic career at this point, largely because of the problems I perceive in the way academic publishing works. And I think I can do more about it in my current position than I can as an ordinary researcher.
What are these problems that you've seen that have turned you off from it so much?
Well, academic publishing has problems at probably every level of analysis, from the economics to how articles are formatted. It's from abstract problems to really mundane problems. Everything imaginable has serious issues. I should preface that I am actually quite optimistic about the future of academic publishing. I'm going to come off as very much not initially, but I have some suggestions for how we might make things better. And a lot of people are working on things that could well make things better. In the relatively near term, I'm admittedly rather frustrated at the pace of change, which is glacial, but we're beginning to see some movement, I think.
I really love to hear that kind of thing, because it's all well and good to point out how everything is falling apart and bad, but having some kind of suggestions and plans and optimism, it's what I need.
Yeah. It's not, as they say, not writing a chapter 11 book where you spend 10 chapters saying everything is shit, and then write one chapter at the end where you say, vote harder, to steal a line from Cory Doctorow.
It is easier to rip things apart than it is to propose better alternatives. So
Indeed. But let's start by ripping them apart, because that's a little bit of fun.
Of course.
And important, so people know why it needs to be rebuilt.
Indeed, yeah. We're going to have some motivation. The first thing I want to do is get everyone angry. The academic publishing market is particularly perverse, even in a world of very perverse oligopoly markets. Let me give you a quick overview of kind of the structure here. There's 5 major publishing companies: Springer Nature, Teller and Francis, Wiley, Sage, Elsevier. They typically make about 40% profit margins.
Holy shit.
Yeah, it's a very big money business. Unfortunately, it's mostly taxpayers' money, but it's a big money business. as is typical of these sort of choke point oligopoly systems, they're both a monopoly, effectively, and a monopsony, which is to say they are the only place where you can sell your services as well as the only place where you can buy things. If you want to publish, you have to publish via them. Just like if you want to sell stuff these days, you basically have to sell it via Amazon. That's the monopsony bit. And then they're a monopoly in that they're the only people where you can, get publishing services from, effectively, if you want to prestige publications.
Could people go to the internet, like archive and personal blogs and such?
Yes. That's only if you want to see things. The monopsony bit's kind of more important than the monopoly bit, right? The ability to get stuff from them is somewhat been torn down by things like Sci-Hub and the open access movement, where you can get papers a bit more readily, but you still can't publish them anywhere else very readily if you want to progress in your career as an academic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And careers are pretty important for people who want to food and rent money.
This was the trade-off we talked about with Adam was that, sure, you can publish on your blog, but you don't get the prestige in your field.
It's a collective action problem, right? It's a multipolar trap. So everyone thinks in order to progress your career, you need to publish in high-impact journals. And everyone evaluates everyone else on the criteria of publishing in high-impact journals, and everyone assumes that everyone is doing that. But if you defect from this little prisoner's dilemma, then you get the equivalent of, from a career perspective, being taken out and shot by the Stasi, right? You disappear, right? It's that same collective action problem that you face. And
I assume this is because universities, if they hire a researcher that doesn't have these sorts of credentials, I don't know, they risk losing their funding or something?
I mean, maybe to some degree, but most of the time it's more in the kind of the grant decision-making type processes. There's a lot of different points in this. So there's the universities getting their funding, but there's individual researchers getting funding, but portions of which then go to pay fees for the university along with tuition. And it's a relatively complicated sort of economic system with the way that money is shoveled around inside academic institutions. So as an individual researcher, you get a grant and then you pay facilities fees at the university, and that contributes to the prestige of the university, and you have all this money that you can spend to pay for students and so on. You need to be able to attract high prestige researchers to have high prestige institutions. Everyone's kind of locked into this way of thinking. But it is very much a problem of the way that we think about it, because the particularly perverse thing about the academic market is we're kind of all the players in that market. We're the suppliers of the material that goes on in academic publishing. We write the articles. We're the provider of the bulk of the labor that's involved in publishing academic articles. That's peer review. And we're the purchasers of the output, which is we consume the articles. We have our university libraries that pay fees to get access to journals in order to see closed articles.
Wow.
So it's all our fault.
Well, and I think from the outside, I've never been really involved in academia. If I'm an organization that wants to fund research, I don't have to strongly vet the PhD department at Stanford if they want grant money. I can kind of just assume that Stanford's done some of the work for me. Whereas if somebody with a cool blog says, hey, I do a lot of cool stuff, can I have $50,000 to get me through the year while I do some research? I might spend some time and resources checking to see if they're just going to steal my money, right? I think independent researchers, that was a thing before science was a real job. That was all science was independent research. Now I think it's kind of coming back.
It is a signaling problem, right? You do need to be able to send a reliable signal that you are good at this, that you know what you're doing. We have kind of a credentialing system of being associated with these universities, research institutes, and having published highly in order to serve as that costly signaling function. But the problem is a lot of the cost of the signal is orthogonal to the quality of the science. Right?
Oh, of course.
So you end up paying a huge amount of extra costs. And it's gameable, right? It's not a very good signal.
Just like getting a degree or really any sort of certification.
It seems like the villain, like in half these movies, is the certification process.
It does definitely
I don't
have
know.
its problems.
It's certainly much, much easier for someone just to be like, I have $100 million and this guy is certified, so I can give him money. But since that just doesn't work anymore, I feel like the person with $100 million really needs to spend some money on hiring someone to research who they should give money to.
Yeah, the sort of getting a new set of signals is a tricky problem. I'm not sure I quite have the best solution to that. I just have I have a lot of problems with the way that the current system generates those signals, and I think that we can bring up a parallel system that will have its own indicators. I'm not sure what those are going to be yet exactly, but I'm anticipating that they will become replaced with kind of a different reputation system, which is more closely mapped to the quality of your work than it is to sort of arbitrary and fairly corrupt sort of institutional prestige things. But going back a little bit more on the way that the academic publishing kind of currently works or has worked historically, the previous business model, the primary one, was kind of subscriptions where you paid in order to get access to the papers. The increasingly common one now is open access journals where you effectively pay to publish in the journals. The only sort of value add that the journals have, in addition to the prestige, I suppose you might say, is they host a PDF on the website. They do a little bit of copy editing, if you're lucky, and they do some kind of admin for organizing the review process, maybe a little bit of curation. But even the curation has systematic biases, right? There's a lot of problems associated with the way that they do the curation, file drawer effect, publication bias, low-level informal corruption of, you happen to know these editors. The value proposition for journals based on the amount of profit they make is just insane.
What is the file drawer effect?
So that's where you leave your results that you can't publish because they're negative, for example, in your file drawer. Something like 90-some-odd% of results that are reported in abstracts are statistically significant, which is obviously impossible.
Yeah.
There's a big publication bias in favor of publishing stuff that turned out to be significant and a bunch of stuff that just wasn't and never got published. Now we don't know what didn't work, so we waste a lot of time doing it again.
The file drawer is the graveyard where null research goes to just rot. Oh yeah, we looked into this, but we didn't find anything. Well, we're not going to publish nothing, so we're not going to take up precious page space saying you didn't find something, so...
It's not necessarily that we didn't find anything. You may actually have a null finding or a finding that goes against the consensus, which means that it would be challenging to get it published.
Oh, that's even worse than I had previously imagined or understood the problem. Because you'd think a challenging finding in our romantic, rosy view idea of what science is, that's the kind of thing that would get the front page, right?
Well, I mean, it's the kind of thing that you can publish that if you've got really good evidence for it. But you might not be able to get away with publishing something that goes against the consensus of kind of your local field if it's just a relatively minor result. Because, all the people who are reviewing it will be like, oh, this goes against the consensus of the field. You've got to do something, more stringent to show it. And you may not have the time or the resources to do something more stringent to show it. But you can't publish it in order to persuade people to give you the time and resources to check it out. So you see the feedback problem.
Yeah. It just seems like you could solve this partially by just putting on there, like, this is weak evidence, but we should look into this more. But that's just, I get that's how blogs work. That's not how scientific journals work.
No. That's most of how scientific journals work.
Oh, wait. Did I say that backwards, or can you repeat that? Sorry.
Most of how scientific journals work is not we have strong evidence for this. It's we've found a little bit of evidence for this, and we think it's probably right. Like, some stuff is actually really robust, but a lot of stuff is, this is the hypothesis. And
that makes sense. What I meant to say was that if you have evidence contrary to popular understanding, and if it's weak evidence, that doesn't get published. It often gets file drawered.
If people who had file drawer reports had some place just to throw them online, some giant shared Google Doc drive or something, do you think they would do that? Or is it actually not worth even putting online if you don't get some sort of journalistic cred for it?
It would probably help, but the incentives to do it are low. There's a little bit of friction associated with publishing it, and you might get backlash. It's just, you can put it out there, but you've got to then kind of get it into the format for a paper and go through the process of trying to get something published, which takes a really long time, even if you're not necessarily going for the highest tier journals, right? It's a lot of effort in the process of publishing a full-on scientific article, which is one of the critiques I have of the way we publish at the moment, is actually like the unit of publication is too big. The way we currently write papers is too large. I think we need to break it up into smaller chunks, but we haven't sort of quite finished with the publishers. I mentioned that there was the subscription model where you paid to get access to the journals, and there's the open access model where you pay charges in order to publish stuff. What do you reckon the price is to publish a scientific article on average in a moderately good journal?
Good God.
$1,000?
I would like to think it's nothing, because the scientific journal would be funded, by the people paying to read it. It's pay to access, and it's the shit journals that charge you to pay them. The publication rags that just will, give us $500, we'll publish a paper, and you can say it's quote unquote published. So disenchant me.
So yeah, that has been kind of a critique of the push towards open access, is that a lot of the sort of high-tier journals have been forced into having a certain amount of open access articles by policy from research funders and so on. They said, like, you have to publish stuff in an open access format. So instead of being able to extract journal publishing fees from university libraries and other institutions, they now charge the article processing charges instead. That's how they've kind of swapped it around. They're still getting paid, but for a different thing.
Do they charge that for all articles or just for the 1 or 2 open access ones per issue?
For the most part, they don't get away with charging you a publication fee if they're also going to paywall the article. Some have tried.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, everyone tries to double dip. Yeah. Paying for a streaming service with commercials.
Indeed, yeah. It's that same deal. And there's some other analogies there. So the article processing fee to publish an article in Cell, a pretty high-profile journal, this is the most expensive one on Elsevier's list, is $10,100 US before tax.
Wow.
Wait, you pay taxes on your publication fee?
It says before tax on their spreadsheet. I didn't look into what tax that might be relevant for, but it lists the prices as before tax. So
wow.
And the median across their 2,619 journals is $2,990 US dollars.
If I'm doing standard run-of-the-mill, whatever, science, I sound smart, and I've got a paper to publish. Hey, look, I found that the hype about plastic water bottles turns out to not be that big of a deal. I'm a grad student at Stanford. I want to get this published. Does that $2,000 come out of my pocket, or does that come out of the grant money that I got to do the research too?
And I see, that's where it gets interesting. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But the way it used to work when we were paying publishing fees to the journals, instead of letting you pay subscriptions to individual publications, bundled them together like cable. They give you all of the shitty channels along with the ones that you actually want. So you have to pay for all of them. And on top of that, they have NDAs with all of the university libraries, so they can't tell one another how much they're paying.
What the hell?
Yeah. It's on us too. We've not been paying adequate attention to the fact that this is going on. Actually, that sort of helps to mask the problem, right? Because academics, for the most part, aren't paying those fees directly. So the universities have sort of switched to an arrangement where they used to be paying like a bundle to be allowed to get access to the journals. They're now paying a bundle to be allowed to publish in the journals. So they've just sort of changed the framing and kept billing them the same amount pretty much with a slightly different way of spinning the story.
And in all cases, it's always someone else's money, so why do you care?
Exactly. Sometimes that does directly come out of your individual funding, like grant funding as a researcher. But I think for the most part, they might actually be happier if it goes via the university libraries, because then you never get to see any of the details and be outraged about it. And then for this, we get a shitty website, a few emails, and maybe some copy editing.
It's fun how all of this is so bad and so gross, and yet wasn't included in Adam Mastriotti's write-up of the problems with peer review. Well, because I guess that was specifically peer review. That's wasn't
peer
publishing.
Review specifically.
Yeah. Now that I say it out loud.
The publishing context more generally. Like, this is relatively widely known within academia, and yet we still haven't managed to do anything about it, solving the collective action problem around it. We've been forking over our copyright to these guys, peer reviewing for them for free, and then paying them to look at our own work for decades, and have not figured out how to do anything better about it. I think the problem is that academic labor in many ways is what's the phrase for it? We have something that's been dubbed vocational awe. We tend to view our work as like a calling. It's a thing that we do anyway, even if we weren't paid. And we're kind of like nose down focused on what can I do to do the work? And we don't pay enough attention to the broader mess or have the remaining energy to deal with it.
Right. The fact that anyone's willing to pay you anything at all is kind of a nice bonus.
Yeah. So it means that academic labor is fairly heavily exploited, and we tend to have a slightly better time of it than most other exploited laborers because we're subsidized by the taxpayer. So
it's always nice.
yeah.
Not so nice for the taxpayer, but I guess we get something out of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, in order for us to have like marginally better lives while not solving this collective action problem, we give billions to the publishing industry for no readily apparent reason.
Well,
Now that I've got us a little bit angry,
A little.
let's talk about peer review.
Some of us are just depressed now.
Yeah,
Where's my liquor?
I looked up that article publishing charge thing this morning and had an aneurysm. I knew it was bad, but like 10 grand. Fuck me. So peer review. I agree a lot with what Adam said 2 episodes ago, was it? There's one kind of minor point of disagreement I have on the sort of science is a strong link problem framing. This is, I think, one of those sort of, there are two kinds of people in the world, those who think that there are two kinds of people in the world and those who do not type problems, right? It's a, it's a slightly oversimplified framing of the situation. In the long run, he's right. In retrospect, it's a strong link problem. And paradigm shifting science is a strong link problem. But more ordinary science is somewhat less so in the Thomas Kuhn sense of ordinary science. Science that you do day to day, while you are still operating within a paradigm, needs to have a sort of certain minimum level of trust in what your colleagues are doing in order to be productive, right? Because if I'm working on one particular aspect of a problem, I need to have a reasonable degree of confidence that a lot of the facts that are kind of peripheral to what I'm doing are at least somewhat reliable. Or I'm just like, I have to redo everything from scratch all the time, right? You need a certain amount of trust in what you're doing, which means you need to some degree bring up, if not the floor, the average. You want to create sort of a pit of success, right? If you're a working scientist, you can fall into the pit and still produce reasonable work. If you have a system that is set up as a pinnacle of success, then it takes a heroic effort to achieve like the baseline level of quality, which is kind of where we are now. And that's not good, right? If you expect baseline quality for heroic effort, then you will not get baseline quality on a frequent basis.
But a pit of success makes it sound like you can just show up at your job, do science, collect a paycheck. Is that
those outputs should still be valuable?
All right, and right now we have the situation where the outputs are not valuable.
Yeah, mostly because you can kind of, it's that signaling problem again, right? You can sort of fake a good signal. You can show up and actually work relatively hard on career-focused stuff that will get you rewarded in the academic ladder climbing type exercise and not necessarily output really good quality work. You'll output work and it will get published in high-prestige journals, but it might not actually be that useful or interesting or relevant to the problems that we should be addressing. Right? It doesn't adequately incentivize prioritizing stuff, and it also is not typically very open or transparent in its processes. So it's difficult to critique effectively because you can't sort of say, "Show me the code," and have someone actually show you the code. It's not systematically expected that you're going to be, called on this kind of thing.
It sounds like the problem is bad incentives combined with lack of transparency.
Yeah, to some degree. Partially, the incentives are also our fault because we decide what they are. Right? We award grant money. We do reviews on grants, so we're deciding who gets paid, and we do hiring, so we're deciding who gets hired. So
when you say
the incentives
when you say we,
okay,
when
so
you say
not
we, do you
me.
mean like the Guild of the Rose, or like who is the we?
I'm doing the typical academic thing of using the royal we, which is
Okay.
like faculty. I'm junior. Like people who have permanent academic jobs and people who are sort of slightly higher up the ladder than me make grant award decisions.
To dig into that a little bit more, I was going to ask the same question. Like, where does that money come from? I'm assuming some of it is from taxes. Who is signing off on grant money, but also whose account does that check come out of?
The major institutions, at least in the UK, that fund this are the UK research councils, right? The research councils, they've been going through a unification, but there used to be several different ones. You had the Medical Research Council, the Biological Research Council, and so on. So the research councils are the ones that are largely responsible for giving out taxpayer-type money. But then you have other large philanthropic-type organizations. So the Wellcome Trust is a big funder of research. You've got charitable organizations like Cancer Research UK, who have specialist interests in types of research. So you get lots of different places will provide grant funding, but the bulk is going to be the UKRI. And in the US, it's kind of a similar arrangement. You've got the NIH, National Institutes of Health, who do a lot of biology research funding. Less familiar with stuff outside biosciences.
Okay. I got a, personal/direct question.
Yeah.
You are a member of faculty, junior member, but
I'm like I say, I'm a research data outputs manager in my current job title. So I work for a large research consortium, basically helping all researchers to wrangle their data outputs.
Could you possibly in the future rise to a level where you are directing money?
In my current career trajectory, probably not, unless I go back in the direction of doing postdoc type research. So I'm kind of more in like a managerial or sort of core staff direction at the moment, which I chose deliberately because I wasn't particularly fond of the postdoc route at this point. It's looking less appealing these days.
Okay. In that case, I'm not sure my question would apply. I was going to ask, like, if you personally would direct money to someone without even a college degree, if they looked promising and were putting good, interesting research up on the web.
I mean, yeah, I think so. This is one of those problems where we're putting a lot of weight in the credentials, and we're putting a lot of weight in sort of very poorly conceived of metrics for these things. So, like, I would definitely. Well, I mean, the thing that I would be more focused, I think, on trying to get people to do is like good open science practices. If people are doing good open science practices or are willing to agree to do good open science practices in order to be funded, then that's kind of my pet peeve. It's getting people to do things openly and reproducibly, which I think solves part of our reproducibility problem down the line.
Well, and even if you were in the role of granting money, I'm sure at some point somebody, like, it's not just one person, somebody's reviewing these decisions. And if the rest of the board or whatever didn't like that you were awarding money to a smart and non-credentialed blogger or something, then they would call you out on it. But
you need the consensus from the peer reviewers who are going to be on the grant panel.
This is one of the things I like most about Scott Alexander's grant process, is that he can personally direct a decent amount of money. And so he's just like, this person over here has no credentials, but they look like they're doing good work. And here's, a few tens of thousands of dollars, which is really awesome. And it doesn't sound like you can do that with a university because it has to go through all this bureaucratic crap.
Grant awarding committees are incredibly conservative in terms of the sorts of research that they're likely to fund. They will fund stuff that they think can yield good results in terms of things that you can publish.
And part of that makes a lot of sense from their perspective, because they're getting their money from somewhere, and if they can't show their money suppliers the fruits of their investment, then we paid a lot of people that looked like they were doing a lot of cool stuff. We've got nothing to show for it. That looks great if you're just trying to figure things out. Like I'm not saying Miri has nothing to show for their work, but Miri didn't get funding through academia. They got it through, well, I guess they're a business and a charity, but that's not the way to get around this. It's like, look, just give us money. If we're doing a project that you're on board with, that sort of stuff.
I'm a big advocate for increased diversity in funding models for research. We've got kind of everything concentrated in this grant model, with very relatively low proportion of funding in more high-risk funding ventures. Just like there's kind of a notion of like venture research, where you kind of have someone who you think is up to something interesting, you give them $100,000 worth of funding and let them do with it what they please. You've got Adam had his suggestion. What did he call it again? Trust windfalls. There's the prize model, where you have some problem that you want people to try and solve and compete to win a prize for.
I'm a big fan of those. The downside is like you need money to pay for your attempt, but isn't that cool? Hey, whoever can build this thing, you guys get $1 million. That's a pretty cool investment.
And then there's also paying staff scientists, where you give people a job and a certain amount of funding on their core resources and just let them do stuff, which works surprisingly well, given that it's like relatively, you'd think that a competitive grant model where you had to constantly write grants and justify what you're doing would yield better results than just like giving people money and letting them do what they want.
But
at least that would attempt to justify, but it doesn't really. I think I need to try and find a study to cite this, but I think someone looked at a comparison of competitive grant funding models versus a Swiss funding model, where they basically just gave people money to do research, and they got kind of a similar quality set of outcomes. But the thing is, you get slightly different types of outcome, right? So grant funded stuff will give you things that you can complete in a nice discrete 3-year project. Okay? Whereas stuff where you just give people a salary and let them do things, they might do experiments in the background that'll take them decades to run. They might not be very expensive to keep running, but they need to be run for a really long time in order to show you anything interesting and have low cost occasional follow-ups. But you can't do that on a 3-year grant funding cycle, because there are different types of question that need to be asked. You need different types of funding model that suit the types of question. And at the moment, everything ends up being like this really one way of doing things approach.
I hate to ask this, but it almost feels like science funding worked better when we had a nobility class with people who just had too much time and too much money. And we're like, well, I don't know, let's give this money to this Kepler guy. He seems like he's looking at stars. That's interesting. And
I wouldn't say it necessarily worked I mean, like, there are other problems with that arrangement.
Yeah, no, I understand. We don't want a noble class to have all this power and money necessarily, but I don't know. The whole bureaucratic extreme risk aversion and
that's
choking the life out of everything.
You need systems that are willing to approach it in a different way, right? That you need the trust windfalls, you need the venture research that Donald Braben, I think. There's a good episode of one of the podcasts I linked in the show notes where he talks about this venture research program that he worked for. I think it was funded by one of the big oil companies, oddly enough. They just sort of gave him a bunch of money and said, you can go give this to researchers. And he went and
awesome.
Just went to scientific conferences and spoke with people and then was like, okay, yeah, this guy seems like he's got a good idea. Have $100,000.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing we want. I don't remember where I saw this, but now that you mentioned it, I recall seeing someone propose that some fraction of the national research budget should just be sent over to a lottery. You get all the proposals, you do a quick pass to make sure they're not outright scams, and of everyone who passes the absolute minimum bar of this is not a scam, you just put them in a lottery and randomly give a whole chunk of money to a few of them.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment it is kind of like that, but with a lot more work, right? Because you have to
with a lot of bullshit on top.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's usually like a lot more people applying for any given piece of funding than are going to get it. So the ability to get funded is kind of you got to put in a bunch of applications and you got to like balance the number you can put in with the quality of those that you can write up, and then you got to try and juggle that against actually doing research so you can get published and retain in your job. And
currently it also feels like there's a lot of politics and there's a lot of credentialism involved in that. So it's not a straight lottery. It's stochastic but shitty.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You might have the best grant proposals and the things that end up deciding that may be non-random in biased ways rather than random in lottery ways. So the lottery would be better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking about peer review, I think.
Yes. So I thought I was kind of starting out with my slight disagreement there about the way that's framed and how to sort of bring that up. So the beginning is sort of fixing things in that regard is I agree also that pre-publication peer review is a terrible idea. I would not mourn were that to die a death tomorrow and we just published preprints. But I think the system that we should replace pre-publication peer review with is open, interactive, and ongoing review that works somewhat differently. The sort of inspiration that I draw for how I think we should do review is very much from the way that open source software development works. If you're contributing to a piece of open source software, you give a proposal to do some work to that project, you get the kind of buy-in from the people who are running that project, and that kind of be the funding stage. And then you go away and you do some of the work, and you contribute that code in, and then you get reviewed, right? So you've opened a merge request to try and get your code into the project, and then the people who are running the project will read over your suggestions, and they'll give you, we need to change this and that, and you've got to tweak these things, and you get it merged in. But it's an interactive back and forth process, right? The way peer review works now is as though it's the 1700s. So we're writing one another letters, like via an intermediary, who is the editor at the journal, which is just like, okay, we've sped it up because we're using email, but it might as well be postal in the formatting. It's not like a comment thread where you can open a thing, go back and forth, quickly resolve misunderstandings, close an issue. It's like, this is a Word document with a list of things that I think are wrong with your paper, and you have to write down your replies to those things and try and reference them by like the line number that you've written in the PDF.
God.
And like the actual workflow is just terrible for trying to do the review process, and no one has fixed it. It's god awful. The workflow of doing Git, even with the overhead of learning Git, is better than the workflow of trying to do it this way. And there's so much sort of like small details in things like formatting and like keeping track of which line number means which thing and which version. And there's no automation around this stuff in a lot of the way that we work. It's still just kind of emailing paper version 3, final. And it's not.
Is that just the inertia of tradition? Like, why don't they switch to even freaking Google Docs?
Okay, so people do collaborate on Google Docs when they're writing papers with their collaborators. Because, obviously, that makes sense, right?
But for the pre-review process.
But for the review process, normally you have to kind of submit it through some arcane website that they have where you upload the paper. And this varies quite a bit. Sometimes you can just get away with like sending them a PDF. Other times you have to copy and paste things into some web form or other. And then you have this whole rigmarole of sending messages backwards and forth in email between you and the editor and the reviewers, because you don't talk to the reviewers directly. You talk to the editor who talks to the reviewer for you, and then the reviewers talk to the editor. And why?
Terrible.
It's a workflow that makes very little sense. So having the process be streamlined so that you can do the review process in the same way that you would collaborate with your colleagues, except that there's more stringent documentation of that process. Hence the comparison with open source, right? In open source, everyone's using Git, the version management tool for software, right? Which means there's a log, right? There's a recorded history of kind of like the interactions that people have made and who edited what and who said things about what at which time. You've got the comment threads on something like GitHub or GitLab, which aren't in the Git repository. But it's a slightly more formally structured version where you have a more rigorous history of the document than you would if you were just using like track changes in Word or the history in Google Docs. So it works better for kind of a more formal process like peer review. So using a set of tools like that would make a lot more sense for the peer review process than using email chains that we currently use.
Has no one moved to this?
One or two have attempted to do so, but a lot of it is kind of a cultural inertia. So, for example, I say the Journal of Open Source Software actually does its reviews on GitHub.
Excellent.
Which, progress. And then there are other journals that have kind of tried to do innovative stuff with interactive reviews, but the tooling around that's still a bit mixed. There's a lot of different results around it. But I think that part of the reason is there's not necessarily a really convenient set of tools that offers you the same kind of formality as the review process, the ability to document that history of exchange of comments that exists in a format that researchers are familiar with using, right? So that's why Git is a significant learning curve in order to get fluent enough with it to use it to do like a document review process. And the sort of version history is not really adequate in something like Google Docs. So no one sort of built the software, the tooling.
Yeah, I might be biased because I'm familiar with Git. Well, I mean, and it was a chore to learn, but I got to think in the scheme of becoming an academic, it probably wouldn't be among the top 10 hardest.
If we taught it would be fine. But we don't.
Exactly. If they taught it,
we don't know it.
I wonder. I'm getting like a PTSD flashbacks to writing papers with. If you're writing like an English paper, it needed like this kind of formatting for your citations. If you're writing a psychology paper, they had their own special way of doing it, and it was just all this stupid hoop jumping. And it would be nice somebody to build a tool where it's like, yes, we're going to do proper version control with that, and it's going to come out in this nice format.
That exists, right?
Okay.
You can do... So, I mean, the way I prefer to write stuff is actually I use a tool called Quarto, which is kind of an evolved version of R notebooks. I mostly write my analysis code in R, so I use RStudio. And then Quarto is a literate programming tool. That it's also a single source publishing tool, so I can generate a website, a PDF, and an EPUB at the same time from the same source material without having to customize the format for those three different outputs. I just edit in Markdown pretty much, sort of a slight superset of Markdown, and then commit those changes. And the CI/CD thing spits out a built website, PDF, and EPUB at the other end, right?
Oh, that's
that
delicious.
would be an ideal way of working, right? Because then you can take in people's merge requests and issues as part of the review process. I think that's the direction that we're ultimately going to head. But I think we need kind of a reskinning of a GitLab type thing, but for people who are focused not on writing code but on writing prose, and make it a bit more usable, which is, I think, very much achievable as a technical means. That would sort of facilitate transition to those next generation set of tools and away from the old way of working, if you can get people to adopt them with a lower learning curve. I mean, of course, the great thing about that as well is it solves a lot of computational reproducibility problems, right? If I'm working on something that's a literate programming document, right? So I'm writing my prose in a simple markup syntax that says these are the subsections, these are the cross references and whatever. But I've also got the code that draws the graphs and does the statistical analysis as a part of that artifact. Then the code is part of what I'm publishing, right? It's there. It's in the artifact that I'm publishing, because the publication unit ceases to be the PDF that's spat out at the end of the process, and it becomes the Git repo. Of course, you can make that better still, because you can make the computational environment part of the Git repo with containerization technology. You can use something like Docker. you've got a Docker file under version control in your Git repo and a tool wrapped around that to build the Docker container and create a reproducible environment for you to do your statistical analysis in with all of the versions of the software that you used baked into it, then you can fully reproduce your workflow.
That sounds outstanding. I realize we're probably getting a little into the weeds,
So
but I love
so that gets
You guys
way into
lost me a few minutes ago.
Sorry, that gets way into the technical weeds, right? So let me backtrack a little bit and talk about try and describe that in more accessible terms for people who aren't software nerds. Let's start with what you need to reproduce computational research. You need the code.
And what problem is this solving?
True.
Like just to reiterate, I know we touched on it, but why do all this? My one sentence understanding is that it makes collaboration in a non-hostile writing environment much more accessible, and running all the code for to generate your statistics and stuff, right?
Yeah. It solves both problems, right? You have an environment on which you can collaborate on your manuscript and document the history of changes of that manuscript, and that's suitable for using in a review process, because the entire point of something like GitLab is, you've got a project and you're having people contribute changes and collaborating on that. And it has to have a very kind of rigid structure because the code has to run, right? So if you're operating it in a production environment, then you have to have quite a lot of formality around the way in which you make changes to that artifact. And you kind of want the same thing for an academic manuscript because it's an important work product. So just the history from Google Docs is not quite good enough for it. With Git, you see who made all of the changes and when, and the sort of the branching structure. And then you have this whole thing around it of when you request to make a change, you say why you made that change, you say what the changes you made were, you've got the history of the changes that you made, you can go back and forth and have discussions about what those changes should be, and you can open issues and say, I have a problem with the way that you've done this, and then you can have a discussion about that, and then you can open a change that fixes that issue. So that whole workflow of how people work on code works really well if you use literate programming stuff as the underpinning tooling for writing. And that's really easy to learn, right? Markdown you can put Markdown syntax on a single page. And if you can learn to use the more advanced features of Word, you can learn Markdown in an afternoon. Git's a little bit trickier to learn, but it's not really hard.
And again, the benefit of this, like you said, is the opening issues, which is to say, I noticed this part could use some work. I'm going to go ahead and propose a solution, or at least just point out the problem. All of that's easily findable. In contrast, exactly. I got an email a few weeks ago about a comment or something on a Google Doc I have with Eneasz from a podcast. The doc was last opened in 2020.
Yeah.
And so I got some email about how the comment was either ignored or accepted. I can't remember, but I have no idea what that was even talking about. And I have no idea how to go about finding out what that was talking about.
I mean, to be fair, you could probably still get a random ping on GitLab or whatever, but at least when you get that ping for a random old issue, it points you to where the issue was.
Right.
And you can see it in the commit history. And so actually, one of the problems that we have in analysis is reproducing our analysis. When we're doing computational analysis, which is increasingly a big part of science, right? There's reproducibility issues separately for lab work, but for computational analysis work, it's a whole other problem for reproducibility. You wouldn't think it would be that hard. You're running the same code on the computer. If you've got the code, it should be fine, right? But no, you need the data. So you need to be able to get the data in the right place so your path to it makes sense, right? You can actually just find it and have the code point to the right place. You need the code, and then you need the computational environment that the code ran in, right? So you need to know what versions of things were there, because you're writing some data analysis code, you're using libraries to do things like draw stuff and perform calculations, and those change over time. So if you don't know which version of it you used, you can radically change the output of the result, right? So if you want to reproduce a computational analysis, you need the data, you need the code, and you need the computational environment in which the code ran. And you want to bundle those things all up together and ship those as a research object, as a research compendium that contains all the information necessary to reproduce the analysis of the work. And you can bake that all in to the manuscript, right? You can build the manuscript with all of your statistics and code ran from the analysis code. Right? It's a really nice package all in one spot.
You linked me when you first contacted me one of your blog posts about showing our work, which I thought made a wonderful comparison between cooking and recipes and this sort of lab work and computational analysis, where in cooking, you didn't want something vague like 7 ounces flour. You wanted something more specific like 200 grams plain wheat flour, all-purpose 550, very technical flour. Yeah. And what the pressure and temperature that your surrounding environment is and all these other things.
Yeah. So the analogy is kind of along the lines of you need the recipe, like the list of ingredients. So that's your data. You need the protocol, the like instructions for making the dish. That's the code. And then you need the environment in which you executed the stuff, which is the kitchen. So like the ambient pressure and temperature and that kind of stuff is also relevant. How hot your oven was, which make and model your oven was, in case it turns out that has a systematic defect and reads wrong on the temperature, right? So those kind of things, right?
And your altitude, Inyash. We're at mile high. Water boils at a lower temperature here.
It does.
Exactly. So that's sort of metadata around the experiment that might affect what's going on. So the context of it. So in the context of cooking, I don't know, that might be the cuisine from which a dish originates and like how it pairs well with wine, right? And who did the cooking. That sort of relatively peripheral information can be relevant to fishing apart what might have gone wrong when you come back to it later.
You had this interesting thing, lab work protocols, where you gave a bad example is a protocol of gel electrophoresis. Did I pronounce that right?
Electrophoresis, yeah.
You said that's bad. A good counter would be agarose gel electrophoresis, 0.5% TBE buffer, 120 volts, various other things.
Yeah, adequate detail to reproduce the work. Yeah.
Do you normally see in a paper a protocol that says just gel electrophoresis without all that additional data?
Wow. That's one of the other sort of pathologies of the publication system is we often have limits on how big a section can be. So how much detail you can put into your methods is constrained by how long the methods can be. And also there are sometimes incentives to not be overly specific if you don't want someone else who's competing with you to use the same method that you did.
So you have an incentive to hide as opposed to make it clear.
Sometimes. Well, it depends, right? Some people will take an open attitude to it and publish all the details. And there's a great platform called protocols.io where people share and collaborate on protocols, where they figure out how to do some complicated series of experiments and very well document what they did, and then they can iterate on it and say, oh, this didn't work for me, I tried this, that worked. So there are people who are working to improve that, but oftentimes protocol level detail is not included in the methods of a paper. So one of the things that was a very disturbing result recently was the reproducibility project Cancer Biology, where precisely 0 of the 190 some odd experiments from 50 some odd papers they attempted to replicate had sufficient detail in the papers to replicate them without contacting the authors.
Jeez.
They eventually managed to replicate a decent fraction of them, but about a third or so of the authors kind of didn't respond to their communications. And but the ones that did were mostly somewhat helpful. But yeah, that's an indictment of the degree to which we are requiring people to publish sufficient detail to reproduce their work when we publish it.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can't reproduce the work, it's fundamental to the way.
That's kind of the whole point, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, the other thing is we do kind of a lot of relatively informal replications of one another's work. So a lot of the time, someone who's trying to set up an experimental system to ask a new question will start from an existing experimental system that someone's documented in a paper. So they'll go to the paper, they'll look at it, they might even contact the original author to try and find the details of what's going on, and then they'll replicate kind of a part of their experiment. And then they know that they've got the system working the same way so that they can go on and do their other work. That's not something that you necessarily publish as a formal replication, but there's a lot of kind of informal replication that goes on.
It sounds a lot like publication has lost its purpose. Like its original purpose was like, look at this cool thing I found. Can you guys replicate it and see if this is true about nature too? Oh my God. And now it's more like, I want my credential. The replication is no longer part of the goal at all.
It's very much a Goodhart's law type problem, right? We're optimizing for publishing papers rather than necessarily making the papers useful for the purpose of sharing the science in the paper. It's like publishing the paper. So having better norms around what the content of a paper should be can address that to some significant degree. If you have norms around working openly, so to bring that whole thing back to the sort of peer review process and the workflow of publishing, if I'm working on an analysis and a paper that I'm preparing in a Git repository where I'm tracking the changes of what I'm doing, not only do you have the history of the review process, but you have my history before I even published it, right? You see what I did at every step. You've got like the equivalent of the lab notebook. And there's an open notebook movement among people who are work in the wet lab, as we call it, wet lab, dry lab, who will share their notebooks, which has the protocol level detail of what they're doing. So that the same thing can be the case for computational people, right? They can share their notebooks by sharing the history of their repositories. And then you do the review process on the repository. So that effectively the preprint becomes, I set my repo to public and I've got a web page that has my paper on it. And then you recruit people to do the review process, and they comment on the repository that you make some changes, and then you issue a version 1.0 of the paper, where this is the one that's got the review stamp. And then if you need to come along later and fix some stuff, or if someone finds a problem, then you can issue a revised version. Because yet another problem with the way we publish at the moment is it's very difficult to revise anything once it's in the record, right? Issuing corrigenda and errata, as we call them, for some historical reason, is a pain in the ass and oftentimes stigmatized and frowned upon. So you made an error in your paper. We need to make that easier for people to correct stuff and incentivize people doing it. If I try and come up with a way of making the peer review process useful and incentivizing it well, the sort of schema that I've come up with is something I call review bounties. So it's another thing that I stole from the open source software community with bug bounties, right, and software development more generally. Instead of paying an article publication fee or processing charge, you have a review bounty on your paper. So I've put up my preprint from my Git repo, and I recruit someone who's going to be an arbiter of this process. So this would conventionally be someone who is like an editor at a journal. They're going to go find me some reviewers who they think are suitable to review this work. They're going to say that the reviewers, you'll get paid a chunk of this review bounty. So if your review is good, if I like your review, then you get a piece of the review bounty. At the moment, reviewers are not paid, right? They're kind of expected to be part of your work as an academic. The person who's being the review arbiter, they also get a cut in addition to their labor as being the arbiter. And then you keep a portion of it left over as a bug bounty. Once the paper's published and reviewed, anyone who finds anything that materially alters the conclusions of that, according to some criteria that you agree and some decision criteria for how that can be arbitrated between the authors and the reviewers, and the arbiter is kind of the person who is the tie break in case there's disputes. But if anyone finds anything wrong with it, they can claim the bounty. So that incentivizes both the reviewers to do a good job and the people to find errors in published literature. And the other thing you can do with that is you can have the review bounty accrue back to the reviewers and the authors over time. So you incentivize people finding bugs quickly, and you reward reviewers and authors for having done their job well, in that they've not had bugs that are easy to find in their work.
That sounds really good.
I like.
I imagine the bounty would have to be high enough to motivate people to do this, but I don't know, a few $1,000s. That's awesome.
Yeah, if you take the existing model, right, the existing kind of levels of article publication fees, it's quite a lot, actually. It's probably more than is necessary to do that. And the cut that you would need to take as the arbiter would be smaller than the cut that the journals take, which is enormous, right?
And since your current one of the cut is zero, it's a big jump no matter how much you're getting paid to find something.
The reviewer cut goes up, the arbiter cut, which is currently the journal, goes down.
Outright fraud would probably be found much faster than, these sometimes multi-decade lags we have right now, because you could just pick up money that's there, and you would be able to, I imagine, I would trust papers more that had a larger bounty. Like, if I heard there was a $20,000 bug bounty on this paper, I would be more inclined to believe that what it says is more likely to be correct, because people have a big incentive to find out the errors.
So that's the other thing you can do with the bounties that's quite useful, is if I'm a third party with an interest in whether or not the outcome of this paper is correct, I could add to the bounty pool.
Oh,
and the same thing for funders, right? Funders at the moment have no mechanism for sort of trying to get the quality of their outputs really assessed, right? Once it's published, it's just published. But if I was funding research, I could say, like, a minimum of 20% of the publication review bounty has to be allocated to bug bounties, or I could add in bounties at the end of the process if I wanted to. There's a lot of different ways you could configure that. That's the best thing I've been able to come up with to align incentives on this. I imagine some people out there might be able to try and break that. I'd be interested in hearing how people come up with exploits.
Hey, I mean, a bounty for finding a bug with bug bounties would be also apropos, right?
Yeah, I need to come up with a bug bounty for my bug bounty system.
Well, I mean,
to stump up some cash.
It's the kind of thing where I'm not exactly sure how it would be gameable, but like a quick example of several years ago when you submitted apps to the Google App Store, the icon on your phone that you click to open the app, someone found that you could put an enormous picture there that then gets compressed to that, little, 1 inch by 1 inch icon. That would sometimes cause like the entire phone to crash, or at least the app to crash. And that's the kind of thing where Google could just, oh, great, we didn't think of that. They do a check, they scale it down, boom, you're good. But that person who figured that out made money.
You issue a minor patch and you're done, right? So same thing is, like, now we have a mechanism for doing corrigenda and errata on papers, right? If it's a change that's changing the conclusions, we can bump the middle version in semantic versioning. What's it called? I'm losing it in my... you've got the major version,
Semvar.
the minor version, and the patch, right? Is it?
Yeah,
I forget. Yeah, so you bump the minor version, and then if it's something that changes the conclusion, you bump the minor version for typos and stuff.
And I threw
so
a
you have an
jargon
indication of the nature of the changes. Yeah,
semantic versioning. That's like where when you download an app and it's like version 2.1.1 or whatever. If it goes 2.1.2, it means nothing. You shouldn't notice anything. Small patch.
Yeah. But that maps really well onto this concept for papers, right? You assign semantic meaning to changing those different versions that are relevant for papers instead of software, and having the minor version be a change to a conclusion and the patch number being typos and stuff. It tells you, when you look at the number on a paper, what sorts of things have changed in its history just from looking at it. It has a semantic meaning.
Have you tried to popularize this review bounties idea? Have you gotten anywhere with that, if you have?
I've spoken to people about it. I've at some point entertaining maybe trying to start a company, but if someone else wants to take that and run, then great. I think this is something that kind of wants to be integrated into a whole, right? It would be relatively straightforward to do it, right? You could take an existing platform that has a really nice integrated experience for doing this kind of authoring and review process. Something like, there's a tool called Renku from the Swiss Data Science Center, which bundles up GitLab, Docker, and Jupyter Hub, which is basically an interactive environment for like editing scientific notebooks for doing data analysis, and like some other tools for doing more computationally intensive pipelines. And then you can send someone a repository, and that's like a completely reproducible version of that research project. But because it's built on top of something like GitLab, it also has the publishing feature built in. So you can host a website on a GitLab server. So, whenever you edit your paper, the edits get put through the pipeline and it spits out the nice version of the paper in PDF form or website form at the end. And you can do all of the review process, right? So if you could take that and bolt on a financial arrangement and found a journal that had this sort of as its submission process, right? You submit your projects via a Git repository that will rerun your analysis from scratch and spit out the paper as a result. And the review process takes place on the platform, and the incentives for doing that review are according to the review bounties model. That would work spectacularly well. I think you'd have to get adoption, which would be a challenge. But yeah, one of the other things that is, I think, really important is that the new ecosystem that replaces the sort of oligopolistic structure of academic publishing as it exists now is that it be a sort of decentralized, open source, federated type structure. One of the things that the arbiters would do that kind of replaces the function of journals is like we still need somewhere to host our results, right? Hosting is still a thing that we want people to do. So if you had people operating instances of an open source tool like something like Renku that has this kind of workflow running through it for doing the publication, then paying them for hosting it and paying them for the compute and the administration of that, for like validating that your pipeline runs on their instance, is another service that can be provided. The business model, if you wanted to do something like this, would be along the lines of something like Red Hat or SUSE or Nextcloud, one of these big open source tool providers for like Linux distributions and replacements for Office 365, where they have an open source product, but what they offer is either hosted services where you can pay them to do like a cloud version of it, or managed services where you pay them for like a support contract and run your own infrastructure yourself.
If anyone were interested in actually trying to spin up something like this, should they contact you? Would you be, do you have the time and energy to to work on this with them?
Absolutely. Yeah. If people are interested, I'll leave my contact information in the podcast. But yeah, I mean, the reason I'm perfectly willing to kind of come and share these ideas is because I don't want to turn this into a proprietary platform where people are trying to publish stuff. Right. I want it to be like a federated network of instances of multiple different ways of doing this. that has a certain guarantee that it can't be co-opted, right? So if you're using an open source code base, you're deliberately choosing not to have a moat, to use the Warren Buffett jargon. You don't have a way of stopping people from leaving your service. You don't have a ring around your business. If you're in the castle and you don't have a moat, you can't be too much of a dick, because someone will come in and kick you out, right?
Yeah.
This is how the sort of open source model, it makes the software a common core resource, and it makes the developers of the software a steward of that software.
Which is what we want.
Exactly, right? They can't be too unpleasant, or they can't be too bad a steward of that resource, or someone else will come along and replace them. They fork the project and do their own thing with it, right? So there's a requirement that you can't be too evil as the steward of the platform, or someone else will come along and take it out from underneath you. You also can't be too inefficient as the steward of the platform, because someone will just come along and operate it more efficiently than you, which leaves you in a position which doesn't work terribly well for venture capital. Because that's a business that you can run with low margins on an ongoing and sustainable basis, but it is not a business that will 100x and make you billions and be a thing that you can float. But it is something that requires a significant amount of upfront investment to build. So tricky.
Maybe something I could piggyback on another project that is similar.
Indeed, that's kind of why I'd like to start with some existing infrastructure. There's a couple of people out there who kind of tried to do something a bit like this. eLife, who's a pretty big journal with a kind of non-profit focus, tried to have a kind of open source publishing platform that was still a bit like the workflow was still very much like a conventional publication workflow, and they were kind of way too ambitious in sort of reinventing the wheel with their whole reproducibility tooling, in my view, of what they tried to do technically, instead of building on the existing open source tooling and kind of modifying it for their purposes. A few of the other things that are worth pointing out in the review space, there's some interesting innovations going on in that area with decoupling review from journals. So there's peer community in and review commons, where people will review your, I think also peer archive, where people will review your preprints.
This is a thing that already exists.
Yeah. There's sort of existing networks of reviewers who are independent of a particular journal, who, you post a preprint and you say, will this review community review this preprint? And they say, we review this and we approve it. And then some journals have kind of teamed up with them and said, we'll accept the credentials of this reviewer network as being sufficient for publication in our journal.
These people are passionate about the subject. They want to read early stuff.
A lot of them kind of want to read early stuff. They want to provide review, and they want to cut the journals out to some degree from the review process and reduce the gatekeeping that they perform.
And that's working pretty well.
Those networks are growing. There's a lot of people working on these kind of open systems and alternatives to peer review in the conventional format.
Should we boycott all journals that don't accept these sorts of peer review credentials?
That would be nice. It would be nice to boycott all. I would not mourn for the loss of the big five publishing companies, because it would plunge the ecosystem into chaos, which would yield a new set of criteria by which we evaluate the prestige of journals. Right?
So the big five don't accept these peer groups?
Well, some of them might. I don't know exactly. I haven't checked sort of which journals are accepting their reviews, but it's clearly a sort of a threat to their model to some degree. It's more of a threat if it catches on for people then not bothering to publish in a journal afterwards, because they can get peer review without the journal. But it's sort of incentivizing people to do the reviewing without the journal is where the review bounties concept comes in, right? It's just trying to get people to actually focus on doing review work in a way that's remunerated and that you're incentivized to do, because there's not necessarily a lot of incentive to do review work without something else as an impetus. If we've got time, there's another little point I wanted to touch on, which was, I mentioned a while back, the unit of publication. So there's a few people who are already kind of working on this. There's a platform called Octopus, which has a bunch of, 8, as you might expect, different publication formats. There's Research Equals, there's Giga Science, and then there's some more niche ones. But sort of the conventional way that we do academic publishing is that we've got primary papers, and then we have reviews, and then textbooks. But the primary paper is a lot of stuff, right? You pack a lot of things into a primary paper. And I think they've been growing. I need to do some analysis of the historical data on this, but they've been getting longer. I'm pretty sure about that. They've been having more content packed into them, even if it's more compressed, right? So that there's more data and more work underpinning a paper, even if the paper itself hasn't gotten longer. So in order to get into one of the high-profile journals, you're having to do more and more work on a single paper. But this is a problem for a number of reasons. It actually makes it harder to read because you have this kind of condensed thing that just doesn't fit into the format of the paper. And you have to go and read a bunch of supplementary material to figure out what they did. It means that they're harder to review properly as well, because you've got a whole bunch of different experiments from different domains that need reviewing, right? If I've done like, I don't know, a series of 14 experiments using a whole bunch of fancy new methods to demonstrate this thing, and I'm only being reviewed by 3 people, then the expertise necessary to cover all of the things that need reviewing in depth is just not present in the review process. So you have this kind of dilution of review, this sort of like diffusion of responsibility over the reviewers to adequately review the content of the paper. And of course, you're asking reviewers to take the time out of their day to review these massive, complicated papers, which they don't have a lot of time to do, right? They're juggling this against all the other priorities they have as an academic. So we have these like enormous papers that are a nightmare to read and can't be reviewed properly, in my opinion. So I think we should break them up into smaller chunks. I think we should basically publish continuously in small chunks as we go and have more tiers, right? So we should have data publications. That's not an original idea. There's lots of concepts of data publications. I mentioned earlier protocols, like protocols.io. They can be a separate unit of publication. Methods, you can have methods papers that are just describing how you do a thing, that kind of similar to the protocols. You can have like software publications where you've written a library to do a particular kind of analysis. Those are all kind of like smaller chunks of different types of academic output that are not conventionally rewarded as a published output in the current way of doing things, but all of which might contribute to a conventional large paper. So if we actually split those out into separate units of publication and have people do a more informal review process, with a more fluid review process like the one we talked about before, on those smaller units of publication, it's less work to do the review, and you can have someone who's actually qualified to do the review look over the content. It sort of splits it up, and it means also credit is allocated better, right? So people who actually did a unit of work get credited for that unit of work, rather than kind of being bundled together in one big publication.
As terrible as Twitter can often be for many things, I sometimes find really interesting little snippets of someone that's just like, hey, I found this. Isn't this kind of cool? And they throw it up on Twitter. I mean, we really could use some sort of like science Twitter thing where someone just posts something like that.
I mean, taken to its logical extreme, there's the concept of a nano publication, which is the smallest unit of publication, from which you could compose all other publications if you were representing them kind of more formally, right? The nano publication concept is related to the linked data people. So it was a concept proposed maybe late 90s, early 2000s by Tim Berners-Lee, where you have the next version of the web is where everything is linked. And you have a resource description framework graph where all of knowledge is represented in this giant graph. So like the nano publication is like a single RDF triple in that data schema, right? So it's a subject, predicate, object structure. And then you can compose all of the other assertions from there on upwards in a machine readable format. But obviously that's challenging to publish manually as a researcher. But a single assertion is basically all the contents of one of these things with a bunch of like metadata structure around it. So every time you make a statement in a paper, it could be made into an RDF triple that's a nano publication. And then, so if you had like tooling in the background with some maybe natural language processing stuff that could convert a natural language sentence into a properly represented RDF graph, then maybe you could come up with a fully structured knowledge graph to describe the contents of papers, which would be a lot more machine accessible.
The machine accessible part, I don't know, that seems hard because I see a lot of even blog posts nowadays that have like various links to tweets or to other things, pulling them all in. I suppose with a decent enough AI, maybe another generation or two, we can get something to pull it all together.
It's a really hard problem to actually get that be something that people can do usably. But like that's the logical extreme version.
Right. That's the ultimate goal.
Yeah. I have a problem with the way we write papers on several levels, but one of the things is trying to condense stuff into too small a space. If you want to publish in something like Science or Nature, they have a really short article length. Publishing in somewhere like Cell, actually, it's a lot longer, so you can kind of occupy more space. But the readability of the article is not great because the language is often unnecessarily complicated. There's actually there've been studies that demonstrate that the complexity of language used in scientific papers has been increasing over time. It's not even necessarily more jargon; it's more like science-specific dialect that is just sort of like science in-group indicators rather than like meaningful jargon. So that makes it worse. But the thing that really bugs me is figures. We do figures terribly.
Figures in what sense?
Whenever you have a graphic in a paper. Okay, let me give it. There's a separate blog post with a whole rant about this if you want to read up. But I'll review it in brief. Right. So if I'm reading a paper, I'm reading through some text, and it says, we showed this in Figure 5A. So now I go and turn over the pages, and I've got Figure 5A in front of me. So it's like a whole page of small graphs, and there's A is in the top left. Okay, great. Now there's a bunch of like acronyms on this graph that I'm not familiar with because it's peripheral to my field, or they've made them up specifically for this paper because people like making up acronyms. So now I've got to go find the acronym in like the other part of the paper, right? I'm now like contorting myself to try and find this other thing because I've got 2 pages now, right? Because I've got my acronyms, I've got this is the context that this figure was spoken about in the text, and this is the figure itself. Right. Okay, now I need to know what's in the figure legend. And that's not even on the same page as the figure for some bizarre reason, because people have weird formatting preferences, especially Cell. I'm looking at you, Cell. You always have stuff on the wrong page. So now I've got 4 different places in the paper that I need to have in my working memory at the same time to understand one graph. And that's
it's too
why
much.
are we doing this? Right? I'm already trying to understand a really complicated concept, and now I have to buffer an acronym, the context of the figure, what's on the figure, and the contents of the legend of the figure in my brain, to try and parse what's going on in the figure. No, put the figure in the text after where it was mentioned, with the legend relevant to that chunk of the figure next to the figure, and give it real titles instead of like 5A. It's a hangover from print publication, because we used to typeset these things for when we would print them out on physical paper, and only the figure pages would be on color glossy paper. You have a whole page of figures in color with the glossy printing, and then you have black and white printing for the rest of the paper. So you have to concentrate the figures in one place in order to and then you have this whole lookup problem, which is worse on computers because you're only looking at one portion of a PDF rather than having a printout where you can actually look at the whole thing in the same spot. Right? So we have to adapt to the new medium. Breaking up the way we write figures would just improve the readability of papers. Maybe that's just, I'm dyslexic, so working memory is not my strong suit. So maybe this is just me, but I'm pretty sure it's not.
It's constantly having to flip back and forth and having your fingers in 3 different places. Yeah, it's terrible.
Yeah, unnecessarily complicatedly worded. You got a whole bunch of stuff jammed into one long paper, and it's spread around, or it's super compressed. So you have to sort of go back and forth between the text and the supplementary materials that accompany the work to figure out what they did. Because mixed in with those cross-references to figures are cross-references to supplementary figures and supplementary data. Even just reading one of these things is a nightmare from just the ability to scan a line, because you read through it and it's in the middle of a sentence, figure this, figure that, supplementary figure this, supplementary figure that, reference, then the rest of the sentence. Just parsing it is not straightforward. It's could we make this a less pleasant reading experience if we tried?
I think the formatting thing too might be not just a pet peeve. I think it's symptomatic of the underlying, I don't want to say disease, but oh yes, it's deliberately obtuse and hard to work with, because that's what makes our industry so prestigious, is that it's actually really hard to do. And if it was easier, well then more people would do it.
Yeah, it is, I think, one of those, it's arbitrarily hard because that signals difficulty rather than actually being hard for a good reason. And then the historical stuff, right? The fact that because it was formatted that way, and because there's massive inertia to change anything in the way that publishing works. So
right.
Everything's still got to be a PDF, and it's still got to be typeset as though it was printed. That's the way we've always done it.
Yeah, which is never a good
but it's
reason
just
to do
gotten
anything.
so much worse because they've packed so much more information into them. But yeah, that's the other thing about that is if you have a separation between the semantic content of the paper and the formatting of the paper, you can choose a representation that you like, right?
Yeah.
Apply a different set of CSS to the web page, and it's formatted however you prefer, rather than however the journal preferred it to be formatted. That makes it much more accessible, right? As well, right? And trying to read a scientific paper with a screen reader is incredibly disorienting.
Do you think this is likely to get picked up? What do we need to do to make people do these things?
My current thinking about the way that you could attempt getting adoption of something like this is I would be targeting some of the scholarly and learned societies who publish their own journals. There's a lot of proceedings of the National Academy of whatever, or proceedings of the Royal Society of this, that, and the other, in various domains that operate their own journals. They oftentimes will kind of like work out a deal with the big publishing houses to publish their journal for them. They are, a potential like low-hanging fruit for an angle of attack to getting people to adopt a different way of doing things. That and, more just talking about this and publicizing the possibility of doing it differently. But yeah, getting some institutions who are willing to kind of get on board with this, I think is an interesting pitch, right? So if you could build a platform that made this sort of reproducible workflow relatively easy and, built in the new incentive systems, and you could sort of pitch that to some of these scholarly societies, I think you might get some bites. But yeah, you need a thing to sell them. Obviously, it might make sense to target a more technical type of journal to start with before you've got all of your polish. So I don't know, some scholarly societies that specialize in data analysis type work, bioinformaticians, that kind of thing, would be a good place to start because they're used to working in these kind of with these kind of tools. That would be my pitch for where you start to get adoption.
Is there anything that the average listener who's not running the Royal Academy of insert subdomain of science can do?
You can write to your representatives. I'm moderately serious about that when it comes to whomever it is who has relevant jurisdiction over or influence over in the government departments for places that hand out cash, right? Whomever it is that has political appointee status, who is in charge of things like the National Academy of Sciences and those sorts of things, right? The people who are closer to the metal on those points but have political positions, talking to them about why are we wasting all this public money in the academic publishing industry? Why are we not having higher and more rigorous standards for the spending of taxpayers' money on research work? As a general member of the public, you can ask those kinds of questions.
I like that. That's exactly the kind of thing I could see Andrew Yang. I could see him arguing about this sort of thing. It's like, hey, you know that UBI thing I'm talking a lot about? Here's some money that we're pissing away all the time. We could clean that up. And I suppose anyone who knows anybody, tangentially or otherwise, who's involved in grant making decisions, they could have conversations with those people as well.
The advice that I would give to anyone in academia is make this stuff a criteria when you're evaluating people. If you're in a position to review a paper, ask about the data availability, ask about the protocols, ask about the reproducibility of the work, right? Ask those questions as part of your review process. Don't just say, oh no, you didn't cite this paper that I wrote on the same subject in your introduction. Ask questions that are relevant to good open science practice. If you're a grant reviewer, look at people's history of open science practice. Are they actually trying to do good open science things in their career? Is that something that they've demonstrated an interest in? And prioritize that in your review of these people over their conventional publication record. And that applies both in grant review and in publication review, right? If I'm reviewing a publication or a grant, those criteria. And make that clear to the editors of journals as well, because if the editors know that you're likely to reject papers for publication if they don't meet these criteria, then they might start pre-screening papers on those criteria. If you want to encourage people to get to do good open science practices, even if it's still going through the conventional publication route. So one of the things that I think should do is construct parallel infrastructure, right? Have the process by which you do your pre-publication work, by which you do your preprints, be something like the process that you would ultimately want to be adopted by the journals, and publish your preprints as reproducible computational artifacts, not just as a PDF on a preprint server, which is at least as bad to read as the as the end result that you get from from a paper that you published it informally, and it gives people the opportunity to have a venue to provide you with feedback informally, and you can use these like existing peer review networks that have been springing up to try and get review on the format of paper that you're now working on. Lots of things that people in the system can do individually to try and push the change in this direction.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been very enlightening.
Yeah, awesome.
Great.
Thanks again.
It was very fun to be back.
Would love to have you back again.
Absolutely.
Great.
Fabulous.
Bye. Stephen, welcome back.
I feel like Richard Acton himself was a good promo for the Guild of the Rose. But
yes, he was.
We ought to make sure that people understand that we are affiliated with them because we think they're awesome, and we're affiliated with everyone they're affiliated with. And this was the first time I've heard of that podcast, The Oasis of Rest. They had 3 episodes in 2022 and nothing since. But I think he said that they're going to try and bring it back. So I've got that on my feed of things to look at. So
yeah. And as always, you can find links to the Guild of the Rose in our show notes.
Yes.
Is there anything we need to hit on before we go into the Less Wrong posts?
This actually comes up with the something to protect, but I'll probably skim past the big part of that, but or the big salient personal part of that. But the short version is like, all those hippies who've been saying forever, like, man, you just get the one life, make the best of it. They're all right. Don't give till it hurts and then give some more, because then you're, it's your life too,
You are ruining at least one life.
And I know that the math says, you're helping more, but it's like, you got to be happy,
Yeah.
That's my first TED talk of this Less Wrong post section. I have a one sentence other one coming up.
Oh, excellent. Well, I want to hear that one sentence TED talk. So let's get into these posts.
You're gonna eat those words.
Oh boy.
All right, first one is trust in Bayes.
This was a whole lot of math, which I guess was interesting, but not something I particularly want to talk about. Did you have any parts of the math section that you wanted to pull out?
No, but remember we had 1 = 2 after 8 levels of proofs or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
We talked about that, and you were pretty, not shaken, but disgruntled that you're like, you know what? I don't feel clean just saying, fuck it, I know it's wrong, even though I can't prove it. This is basically saying it's okay to do that in some circumstances.
Right.
And unfortunately, that's going to be taken as, licensed by anybody who wants to believe anything in the face of contradictory evidence, but it has a high bar. Yeah.
It has the weight of all of math behind it.
Right. Algebra is not, like, the basics of algebra are not wrong.
Yeah.
they actually can't be. That's the thrust of this post. Not just that algebra can't be wrong, but that, as he puts it succinctly, we should take into account our past experience of seeming contradictions which turned out to be themselves flawed. Which is to say, if you've encountered examples of this impossible thing was true, oh, no, I was mistaken. Well, that's actually evidence that you're mistaken this time, too. On the 1 = 2 proof. Back to the quote. Based on our inductive faith that we may likely have a similar experience in the future, we look for a flaw in the contrary evidence. This seems like a dangerous way to think, and it is dangerous. But, like I said, with the intellectual caveat that you're doing this with philosophical and cognitive rigor and not just doing this to defend your pet theory, I think that your inner Bayes fairy will yell at you if you're doing this wrong. I should hope, after some level of training.
Yes.
I love how every Less Wrong post basically makes me think of the New Atheism Wars just because of the time they were written. But I don't think evolution or any of that comes up in this, but there was that common rebuttal of like, well, what would disprove evolution? And I forget who it was who was said to have said this, but I remember Dawkins quoting him saying, fossilized rabbits in the Precambrian. Honestly, that wouldn't falsify evolution for me. It would make me think that someone fucked up or is lying way before it made me think that, I guess, my whole understanding of the history of the planet Earth is wrong. Right. Or not just my understanding, but everyone's. Right.
It would be a big red flag to look into this thing right now, and maybe after a lot more looking, that could start overturning evolution. But it wouldn't do it by itself.
Right. Like with that, 8-step proof that 1 = 2. If this was driving mathematicians insane, then I'd be like, oh shit, maybe there's something to this. Yeah. But the fact that no one's lost any sleep over it then makes me pretty confident that I have nothing to worry about.
Yeah, if the more obsessive mathematicians start literally killing themselves because of this thing, then I'd be like, oh shit, something bad is happening in math land. I read at least one short story like that.
That's awesome. That's where he goes through all the proofs, and he talks about. Actually, I forget the guy's name because I didn't pull it out in any of my notes here. But basically, Dutch booking proofs where if you go an infinite number of times, you always lose money or something. Mm-hmm. And Yudkowsky says, now, there's a number of replies I could give to this. I won't challenge the possibility of the game, which would be my typical response as an infinite set atheist, because I've never actually encountered an infinity. I like that answer. It's like, sure, yeah, if you do this forever, this happens. Like, yeah, but you know what? I'm never going to do that forever.
Right.
So I'm kind of just okay saying, sure, right?
Like when we did the little Dutch booking experiment in our Less Wrong meetup, where in expectation I gain like 20 cents per time we do it, and we did it twice, and you were like, okay, I'm done.
Right.
It's like, wait a minute, I have currently gotten in real life 0 cents, and I'm hoping we go at least long enough till I get 20 cents once, and maybe infinite times, so I take all your money.
Well,
yeah, I don't have infinite time.
And as it worked out, neither of us lost a dime. So
yeah. He does do all the math stuff here to show how the two different types of infinity were not commensurate, which is why this fell apart, the supposed infinite Dutch booking. But the ultimate point that he's trying to make with this post, he says at the very bottom, is that Bayesian probability theory and decision theory are math. The formalisms provably follow from axioms, and the formalisms provably obeys those maxioms.
Axioms.
Sorry. Yes.
Yeah, you're really close.
And I think that is the major thing that I think he's trying to push with Bayesianism here. And it's interesting because that's not how we, like by we, I mean you and me specifically, use it in our lives. We don't use it as a formal mathematical theory. We use it as a sort of guiding principle on how to approach things in our life generally. But he's making the point here that when he's talking about Bayesianism, especially in the context of decision theory, he's talking literally about a formal system that has axioms and rules. And just like math, if you apply it correctly and you have valid inputs, then you will always get valid outputs. As far as you can trust math, that is also how far you can trust Bayesianism when it is applied correctly and rigorously, which is a cool thing to point out.
Yeah, I mean, it's mathematical theorems, right? Like there's nothing more foundational as far as my understanding of how these things work. So yeah, at the end of the day, he's like, look, man, this is real math. Like, So if you can come up with a clever thought experiment where, something stupid happens, well, I don't know, forget it.
I do think it's important for us to not conflate the two, because we do call ourselves Bayesians often, or Bayesian rationalists, and we like Bayes' theory, and we draw attention to how it can guide us in the real world. But I think it'd be a really good idea to stress maybe once a year at our Bayesian church gatherings or whatever the hell we end up doing, that we are not doing actual math. What we are doing is different from this, and we should not try to take the weight and power of math as justification for how we live our lives. They're two different things.
Yes. Maybe one should be called, Bayesian decision theory, and one could be called maybe Bayesianism, which I don't like isms, but if I had to, because I don't think a probability theorist would call themselves, would say that they're Bayesists, right?
Yeah.
But that's the the one sentence version of that is an understanding that I don't, when I get in my car and start it to go pick up groceries, I don't know that there's not a squirrel hiding in the engine block that's going to be ripped apart when I start the car on, right? But I'm sure enough that I'm not going to bother checking. It's an understanding that my mental model of reality is probabilistic, not certain, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think so that's what we're doing. If you're doing decision trees or something, like they teach over at the Guild of the Rose, you're throwing some actual math in there, and the more refined the technique, the better, the more mileage you can get out of it. But I think just the framework by which you orient yourself towards reality is what we're talking about.
Yes.
Right on.
Shall we go on to the second post, which is much more about the whole how to live your life thing?
Yeah, let's do it.
Next post is something to protect.
Popular. I love it. He opens it with saying, in the gestalt of Japanese fiction, and I put in brackets, and Marvel movies, one finds this oft-repeated motif. Power comes from having something to protect.
Whoa, hey, hold on. I must stop you, because I think that is definitely not true of Marvel movies. He specifically calls out a typical Marvel movie
I know.
in the post.
He says in Western comics, magic comes first, then the purpose. Acquire
Yes.
amazing powers, decide to protect the innocent. In Japanese fiction, often it's the other way around. However, in Marvel movies, typically they're heroic before they get their powers. You know, Captain America was getting his ass whooped trying to do the right thing before he had the power to not get his ass whooped.
I suppose that's true of Captain America.
I told you wouldn't like my second TED Talk.
All right, I thank you for doing that.
Yep. But we can.
I guess they are trying to do it more with the MCU stuff that came around in the early aughts, mid aughts. I don't exactly remember when all that started.
I think Iron Man came out in 2008.
Okay, the mid to late aughts then. I like the distinction that he drew here between Japanese fiction and American comics, because it does seem like very much in the Japanese anime manga style, at least of that earlier time, 80s, 2000s, it was very much I am powered by my desperate desire to do a thing. Like, the more you had to do a thing, the more power you got, which has been, I guess, adopted a bit more in the West, but it's less. Like you said, it was first you get bit by a spider, then you're like, oh, I have this great power. I guess that comes with great responsibility that I got to use. And the aspect of desperation that drove the characters, and that is how they found the power, was a really neat thing about anime that was very cool when you were first seeing it coming over.
Yeah, I think for me, maybe part of the reason I wanted to end this is not the point of the post, but part of the reason that line didn't resonate with me is I haven't consumed enough of that kind of Japanese fiction. Like, the only one that I can think of is Kenshin.
Okay.
And
Kenshin is actually a pretty good example, isn't it?
I think so.
He keeps getting better as his conditions are more dire.
And his something to protect, is what actually makes him the best he can be.
Mm-hmm.
But the, like other examples, I don't know, Attack on Titan, you've got the crying, screaming protagonist. At least at the first few episodes, I fell off fairly quickly.
It was, yeah.
And that seems like a pretty common trope, and I hate that.
Well, it got it got flanderized, I guess, over time.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
And then Death Note, he was, with great power comes great responsibility all the way, right?
Yeah, he was definitely much more of the Marvel style.
Yeah.
The power comes first thing.
In only that exact way.
Right.
He did it to become the best supervillain he possibly could be.
Yeah.
All right. So, go ahead and grab some more of these. You pulled out some of the quotes, but I was basically going to pull out everything you did. So
he goes back to the saving 400 lives with certainty versus saving 500 lives with 90% probability and no lives with 10%. We talked about that the last several episodes. He comes back to this and says, a lot of people may be tempted to grandstand, saying, how dare you gamble with people's lives? Obviously go with the 400 lives with certainty. You can't take a 10% probability that 500 people are going to die. But when you're actually making this decision and you don't know what's going to happen, maybe your daughter is one of those 500 people. If you don't know what the actual outcomes are going to be, and your daughter's life is on the line, maybe then you feel a bit impelled to shut up and multiply and notice that you have an 80% chance of saving her in the first case and a 90% chance of saving her in the second. Because in the first case, you save 400 lives and the other 100 are gone. When you have your daughter to protect, then suddenly you actually care that there's a 10% greater chance that she's going to live.
I love this because this actually really perfectly drives home. Intellectually, it makes perfect sense, right? The math says 450 on average, as opposed to 400 for sure. But the second he says, but if your precious daughter is one of the 500, then it's like, oh, shit. Suddenly, it could be a 10% chance to save them. Now that I'm imagining a strong emotional connection to the actual outcome rather than just, numbers on a chalkboard, then it's like, viscerally, I need to know which one's the better choice, and I'm totally going to do it, right?
Yeah. And that is basically his entire point through this post, is that when you actually really fucking care about the outcome, then you stop becoming attached to, I have to support this position for whatever reason, and you become insanely attached to, I need to know which position is the better position. And I believe Julia Galoff calls that the difference between the soldier mindset and the scout mindset. When the results really matter, what you care about is knowing what's the better course of action to get the results you want, rather than just what is the argument that I'm supposed to support. And that is why he says having something to protect is the only way to truly be a rationalist, because otherwise there's just so much drive as a human to sometimes support certain arguments or to be lazy and fall back to heuristics that everyone else is using, when suddenly it's really important. Like, then all of a sudden you have a huge motivation to really get down and find out the correct answer. That is the whole gist behind this. That is what you need to drive yourself to actually find Bayesianism and apply it correctly, rigorously, and often.
I agree. I don't want to belabor on it too long, other than just to consider the possibility that one might find compelling reasons to lean in more into soldier mindset than scout mindset if you have something important to protect going on, because that thing might be more important to you than, an honest evaluation of the evidence or something, right? Let's say it was 80% probability of saving 500 lives instead of 90. Oh, wait, then the outcomes are the same, aren't they? Let's say it's 70.
Okay.
Or 50, you don't care because it's your daughter. You might bolster your case with, and this is why soldiering is kind of dangerous when trying to be a good rationalist, but you might bolster your case with saying, look, you might grandstand and say it's more lives. How could you condemn them to death? Yada yada. You might make all the bad arguments in favor of choosing the lower likely outcome because one person in there is someone you really care about. And frankly, that's totally something I would do. I'm imagining two different pools of people, I should say.
No. The whole point is that there's only the one pool of people.
All right. Well, in my hypothetical, there's two.
Then that's the wrong hypothetical, because obviously if what you really care about is the daughter, then you choose whichever one lets you save your daughter.
That's what I'm saying.
But if
that's
you're not the case here.
But if you're just the boat captain choosing how to exercise all the resources of like life rafts and stuff or whatever, right? And you're making this real life decision, and you don't know anyone else on board. They're all just customers. You're going to go with the one that saves the probabilistically max number of lives.
Well, if one of them is your daughter, but you don't know which one, then you go for the probabilistically max number of lives.
Yeah.
That's why if you have the 500 lives and it's a 50-50 probability, then you would go with the 400 lives with certainty, because that saves more lives in expectation and thus maximizes the chance of your daughter being saved.
Maybe I illustrated my point poorly and too strongly, because it was so absurd that, or like so poorly rational that you had to jump in. My point is that you might use arguments to support your bad position because you really care about the outcome that you're choosing, right? So that's why I say that soldier mindset might be risky there, or rather, it's great for you, but it's risky in general for trying to do like the most actual good, right?
Yes, that's the point. You aren't trying to do the most actual good. You're trying to maximize your outcome.
Right. And your outcome is fuck everyone else. I care about my daughter.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is what he is saying. When you have a goal you really want, when you have something you actually want to protect, you will use rationality to achieve that goal. You're assuming that for some reason his goal is to save the maximum number of people, and that is not the case at all. His goal is to save his daughter.
Right. I should make up an entirely different hypothetical. I guess my point is that you might use rationality to reasonably resort to making bad arguments that sound compelling to convince people to do the thing that you really care about instead of the thing that would best interest them, because you really want your daughter to live or something, right?
Yes, that is, again, using rationality if that is going to achieve your goal.
Oh, okay. I guess I would consider that more... if you're knowingly making bad arguments to persuade people to do the thing that is in their worst interest but is in your best interest, I wouldn't consider that ideal rationality, more like the dark side rationality stuff.
Yeah, that's dark arts rationality. And as a society, we want to discourage people from doing that because of the reason we want to discourage anyone from doing antisocial stuff. But the whole point is that if you were truly exercising rationality, you would do the thing that maximizes your outcome.
Yeah, no, I get you. I feel like I belabored on that too long. And maybe I didn't articulate my thought all the way beforehand. I feel like I
think that you gave a very good example of how you would, if you had something to protect, look for things that actually get you your goal, as opposed to just following nice rules.
Yeah, it would change your orientation to the problem, which is totally legit, or rather, which makes sense. I guess. I mean,
we're getting into the case where what we're trying to do is align people's individual goals with society's broader goals, but that's different from why would you use rationality in the first place?
Yeah, no, totally fair. I feel like I had a point that I failed to make, and now I'm struggling to remember. So let's push past it.
Stephen, thank you for joining me again one last time. We talked past each other a little bit because the post is about instrumental rationality, like how to get what you want in a particular situation. when you want something, rationality is one of the premier tools for figuring out how to actually get that.
It's the premier tool, sir.
Okay. It's certainly definitely in the tool bucket on the very top shelf. Tool bucket? They have shelves, yeah?
And it's, I mean, of course your buckets have shelves, but it's also the tool that tells you which other tools to go get.
Exactly. Then we started talking about what if it's rational to kill 100 people to save your daughter or poison the beliefs of the people around you. In my mind, when I was editing, it reminded me of the whole problem with FTX where Sam Bankman-Fried is like, well, you know what? I want billions of dollars right now so I can direct them to the best use that they could have. So I'm going to just scam thousands of people out of all their money so that I can use it for what I think is best. So that's super rational, right? It is not, as we covered in the episode on that, primarily because the world still exists after you've done that, and you have destroyed many things doing that. Maybe sometimes for you personally, it might behoove you to do something like that if what you really care about is saving your daughter, even if it means that they're going to string you up and slowly torture you to death for what you did. But in terms of general ethics, the study of how to all get along together and to get other people to do things that are good for ourselves and each other, that is not a rational thing to do because you are going to be burning the commons, destroying the ability for people to cooperate, and in general, making the world much worse overall. So I think that is where we had the major disconnect, that it might be rational in one particular instance to do something like that, but it is not rational overall to use that as a guiding principle of I just do whatever I need to get what I want, because that actually has much worse effects in the long run.
I totally agree. I think I made that whole section, I don't know how much you cleaned up, but it was way less coherent than it was in my head. And like the short version of what I was trying to say was that in certain circumstances, it's rational to use dark side epistemology because you have goals that you care about more than the truth. Your goal is save this person or whatever.
But in the long run, it's always bad.
Right. It's never rational to defect. Well, I mean, so this is where if you have something to protect that is more important to you than the commons. Like, there was that really cool movie, John Q? I can't remember what it was called. I think it started Denzel Washington. Where he takes a hospital hostage because his son needs a new heart. And it's awesome. I think I saw it probably when it came out 15 years ago. It's not a spoiler. I think he goes to jail at the end, which makes sense. You know, he put a gun to people's head. And yeah, I think that you're supposed to leave the movie feeling like, that guy's awesome. It sucks that he had to do that, but it's like, yes, I'm willing to violate, like if you carry your kid to the hospital with a broken bone or whatever, you don't expect the doctors to drop everyone else and rush to your kid, even though you would like them to, because you realize how insane that would be.
I mean, the game theoretic correct action for the rest of society after he's done that is to take the heart back out of the kid, because otherwise people are going to be incentivized to do this.
I mean, yes, makes one wonder what they would do on Dothalan, although I don't suppose that circumstance would arise there, but there's something that insane did.
Maybe that's what the surreptitious head removers are for.
Could well be it. Well, I appreciate the clarification and the ability to more succinctly deliver what I was trying to say.
Okay. Once you have something you really want, you start using all your tools to get to that thing, whether that includes lying to people or not.
That actually might be the point that I was trying to make. Maybe I shouldn't have gone on the whole tangent about soldier and scout mindset. You care about rationality, you care about the truth, being honest and being a fair person, whatever, right up until something more than your life is at stake. Then you're like, okay, now I'm actually I'm going to try and get it done no matter what. Even if I have to lie, kill, and steal, right?
And to get it done no matter what, you want the best tools that you can possibly get your hands on, right?
Right.
And that is why you would use rationality. Once you really fucking care to that degree, you're like, this is the best tool for the job. And the best tool for the job is thinking about things rationally and multiplying the numbers and seeing where your greatest chance of success lies.
Yes. Well put.
All right. Eliezer does go on to say, do not mistake me and think I am advocating that rationalists should pick out a nice altruistic cause by way of having something to do, because rationality isn't all that important by itself. No one can just pick out a cause like that because you feel you need a hobby. Go looking for a good cause and your mind will just fill in the standard cliches. Stephen, should I even draw in the obvious EA parallel, seeing as that we've just been talking about recently?
I think it can be explained in under a minute, which is that your average EA will look to the community and say, hey, what's the most important cause? Because I care, and do that. But what they're doing there is different than trying to... They're not... I like the line in here that no one masters the way until more than their life is at stake.
Yeah.
Your average EA isn't somebody who's in that circumstance. So I see how it relates, but it's not quite the same. The people who are looking for the cure to something tremendous, like the ones maybe who are doing the intense research might be closer to the ones who are driven this way, right?
I don't want to say that the average EA is like that. I think most people are strongly driven to try to help the world and to save lives. But if I were to try to do that kind of thing, I feel like I would be doing this sort of picking a cause thing, as opposed to really actually caring about something that is intensely important to me.
Oh, see, I didn't even...
I don't know. Does that make me super selfish?
No. I think it makes you better at this sort of thing than I am. I did the lazy third option, which is I checked the box on GiveWell's website of give this money to the cause that you think needs it most right now. So like I didn't check BedNets or Give Directly or whatever. I checked the box that says you guys spend it to wherever it needs or wherever it's needed. You guys do the thinking. I don't care.
I think that is the correct thing to do for most people. And since we were just talking about aligning personal incentives with social incentives, the whole thing that we've done where there is pressure by society to get everyone to give 10% to an effective cause, it's basically a good thing. It's doing this whole aligning social incentives with personal incentives thing. That is not a thing that drives you to adopt rationality and to use it relentlessly in your life. No. Because, you don't have that driving, burning passion. You have social pressure, and that's good. But it's not having something to protect in caps, like is pointed out in this post.
Yeah, that's why EA and rationality have an overlapping Venn diagram, but aren't one-to-one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and I think a lot of the people who work directly in EA are the ones that do have a more burning drive like that.
Totally. Maybe I'm simple-minding. Maybe the average, EA puts in more work than I did, but I'm going off of myself there. So
I almost feel like there's a member in good standing in the laity, if you're giving your 10% and you're being as effective as you can be, and then there's like the cleric class who actually are driven and do the work and research to see what's the best and are constantly updating their models and their quality adjusted dollars per life saved thing.
I think you're right.
And we use the term EA for both of them, but they feel like slightly different things.
I think this is nicely related to, we use Bayesianism for two different things, right?
Yeah.
All right. It kind of comes full circle. Maybe you have like an EA. I don't want to actually give them quick labels because I feel like it needs more deliberation. I was going to say you have like participants and forerunners or something, right? And I'm much more like the back of the participant line than I am in the forerunner line.
Right. And I think there's nothing wrong with that.
Not me either.
He does end by saying, but if you have a cause like that, it is right and proper to wield your rationality in its service, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
That is what rationality is for.
I agree.
For our next episode, we will be covering the less wrong posts, 3 of them this time. Newcomb's Problem and Regret of Rationality, that is 1. The Parable of the Dagger as 2. And The Parable of Hemlock as 3.
Heck yeah. All right. This episode's glorious patron shout-out goes out to Bowen K. Total badass. We appreciate you.
Bowen, thank you so much. You help make this a thing that we want to keep doing, I guess. That came out wrong.
No, it's also true. But you help bring this to people. You keep the lights on around here, and we appreciate it. We appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. You are a scholar and a gentleman, and you help to fund the things that are not funded by the bureaucracies.
Well done.
Because we don't have any credentials.
Let's end on a high note.
All righty.
We'll see you in a couple weeks.
Bye.